Hello, and welcome to the panel on the TV-ification of film. We're now live, and you can also start your questions in the chat whenever you have them. We're here today talking about the TV-ification of film with the panelists R.B. Kelly, Kim Newman, Robert G.E. Simpson, and Louise Fortune. I'm going to read the description just so we set the ground straight from the beginning. How did making original films just become about setting up a sequel? So much of what we watch now feels like pilots for TV shows that never get made, all being thrown at the screen in the hope of creating instant fans for an ongoing multimedia brand instead of just making one good thing, and then if that works, making another. Join us now as we explore the negatives and positives of these strange new worlds that have birthed thousands of orphaned fans and many hashtag campaigns. Okay, so I think we can do the introductions. If you would like to introduce yourselves and say a few words before we start the questions. R.B. Kelly.
Hi, okay, I'll start. I'm Rachel Kelly. I write science fiction as R.B. Kelly, but I'm being Rachel Kelly today because I reckon I'm here with my film theorist hat on. I have a PhD in film theory, and with Robert J. Simpson on the panel, I co-run Cinepunct, which aims to bridge the gap between film fandom and film academia. Though to be fair, he does most of the work and I just turn up and have opinions on things.
Okay, now then, Robert.
What she said. Yeah. I'm a film historian. Used to work for the likes of Hammer Films, and as Richard says, I'm involved with Cinepunct. I broadcast a bit on the BBC, and I have just published a book on The Wicker Man. So I'll get my plug in for that because
it's very good.
Brilliant. Now, Anne-Louise.
Good afternoon. I'm Anne-Louise Fortune. I have an undergraduate degree in film studies. I've just completed an MA in popular culture at Edge Hill University in England. And yesterday I started a PhD in film and media at the University of Stirling. I have a sort of audience, what's the audience doing? How is that appreciated by them? Approach to looking at things. My research for the PhD is going to focus on gender representation, and occasionally I write things for Starburst magazine, the UK-based long-running genre entertainment magazine.
Beautiful. And Kim Newman.
Hi, I'm Kim Newman. I'm a novelist and critic. I've written a lot about film over the years, in fiction and in non-fiction. I've worked for Sight and Sound and Empire magazines. I was the lead writer on Mark Kermode's Secrets of Cinema. And I've generally spent a lot of time watching and thinking about films and indeed television.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I'll be your moderator today. My name is Anne-Louise, and I manage the Irish Film Festival in Russia. So the first question that we'll open this conversation about what's the first film that comes to mind that should have been just a television show instead of trying to set up a sequel? And of course, we will not be probably talking too much about Dune, as we have established that not many have seen it yet. But if you have questions about this, we would love to see them in the channel. So maybe start with Rachel.
Gosh, you see, I don't know, because I don't necessarily think that the TV-ification of film is a bad thing, and I'm actually quite broadly happy with that direction of travel. So I'm looking at things, the sort of the big sort of epic years spanning I'm thinking about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and that, that arguably the greatest sort of example of the TV-ification of film, and thinking I actually really like what they're doing there, and I really like the capacity of that to focus on smaller details. I mean, it's kind of like soap opera with superheroes to a certain extent, because it gives you the opportunity to take those character beats away from the splody, boomy, shiny stuff, and to have those quieter moments, and to have that kind of developed over multiple correlating character arcs. I really like that. I mean, if we're talking about films that should have been a standalone film and not sequels, you know, The Hobbit, but not for different reasons, I'm not sure making that a TV series would have solved the problems of stretching a small book like that over 3 massive epic films.
Okay, Robert?
I've struggled to think about this one during the week because I've obviously got a lot more generous with my opinions on these things since lockdown started, and I'm just happy to have something that entertains me. I very seldom like I think I'm more often gonna see a TV show that I think probably should have been a film than I see a film that probably should have been a TV show. You know, I would rather like a shorter narrative than a longer drawn out one. It's very seldom that you see something unless it's an epic. I mean, but as, you know, as Rachel's already said, like it's the Marvelification, really. You know, this whole franchising that we get with everything is just endless and endless, and it's kind of frustrating. I find it very difficult. I mean, essentially what you've got the TV episodic formula then approached onto a much longer structure, and I suppose it kind of works. It's good that it gets people coming back in, and franchises are something that have always existed. I mean, it goes back down to the days of sort of serials, you know, and you know, film serials before we ever had television, and I suppose even before that, you know, you've got serializations of stories in magazines. I mean, so it's a fair enough approach to do it. I don't know. I mean, this is a quite. I'm going to have to mull over this during the course of this conversation and see if I can find anything that really gets my goat by the end.
Okay, great. Anne-Louise?
I think, to slightly possibly mirror something Rachel said, I think the Lord of the Rings movies should probably have been a TV series, which of course they are now going to be, because it just felt like there was so much going on in those 3 movies, and then you get the director's extended cuts on the DVD box set that's got even more in, and it sort of, I think, slightly speaks to this thing that a lot of fans of any book that's ever been adapted into a film will say, which is, oh, but they missed out scene X, which was my favorite one, which, in generally speaking, in a TV series with the longer running time overall, you have more space to fit in all of the stuff from the original text, because overwhelmingly still we're in an environment where film and TV are both adapting pre-existing texts.
And Kim, do you have a?
Yeah, as the examples I'm thinking are, it's a couple of films, and maybe it's even a little cycle or a subgenre of films made by the American writer-director John Sayles. I'm thinking particularly of City of Hope, but also of Lone Star and Limbo. These are films from mostly the early 1990s, and I realize they were made before television was ready to do the kind of long-form, multi-character, yet still closed narratives like The Wire or The Sopranos or Breaking Bad. And it's almost like John Sayles had invented that format before there was before television, or American television rather. British television had always done stories like that. But before American television was ready to accept those things. So those movies, I mean, they're endlessly entertaining and revisitable, but you can't watch them without thinking, yeah, that's a terrific pilot. Now, what happens to all those characters over the next couple of months? How does this tie in? And I think that it's not just a thing to do with the way TV and film mirror each other in terms of narrative strategies or entertainment strategies. It's the way that both media have been evolving to suit the way we consume visual narrative. And in fact, there is this other thing that we now have, the short form streaming series, which probably predates the existence of streaming platforms. I think HiMat is the first thing I can think of, which was released theatrically, although that took a hell of a lot of sitting through all 11 hours or whatever it was. I also think of Lars von Trier's series Kingdom, which also was released theatrically, at least in Britain. And now we have these things, I'm thinking recently of stuff like Brand New Cherry Flavor or The Queen's Gambit on Netflix, which aren't TV series, though they look like them, and they aren't films either. They are broken into episodes for convenience, but they're not conventional watch an episode a week television. They are almost designed to be watched as 8-hour-long narratives. I don't think we can even call them films. They are something else that nobody has quite come up with a name for. And even the people making them haven't quite clocked that they are different from television.
Yes, thank you very much. There's certainly a discussion here about those two different approaches, maybe. A Disney version of franchising theatrical releases and this Netflix approach moving on towards the way that they are fighting people's sleep time for them to get this content into their brains, right?
That they sort of claim to have invented a format that British television has been doing since the Quatermass experiment in 1953. The idea of the serial, we used to call it, 6 or 7 episodes of a story told and finished. And okay, some of the characters could come back if you did a follow-up. But it was a thing. America used to call it the miniseries, but the serial tends to be the form I still think of it as.
If we're talking about this film franchises versus TV sort of thing, so what does a film franchise need to do to avoid being felt like a TV or a series or a serial, right? Maybe Robert?
I think traditionally I've always thought of sort of TV as being a smaller, kind of more confined space. That it's somewhere that tells the smaller, more intimate stories, whereas film should always have been big and epic. I mean, that was the whole attraction about film versus television back in the 50s and 60s, was that film offered you something that you couldn't see on TV. Whereas, of course, now we all have massive televisions in our rooms, in our bedrooms, in our living rooms. We have projectors at home. We've brought the cinema experience into the house. So our television has gone and done sort of those filmic things because we can watch it in that kind of way. So I think to avoid film like television, it probably still needs to play better towards scope, towards big landscapes, everything bigger was always the thing. And I think I still kind of like that feel, even though there are many films that are played quite small that I really love. I like a bit of tension. I like something that's set within a couple of rooms, just because I'm kind of in the middle of doing more research on Hammer again at the moment. I mean, I think it's something like Cash on Demand, which is a sort of Christmas Carol tell. It's all set within a bank, and it's basically a two-hander between two people. I mean, something like that, where it's
a
nice
remake of a TV play.
Yeah. I mean, you've got that kind of influence too, yeah. But it is something. It's a small story. It's not a big one. It's much more intimate. Maybe that's the thing. Television for me probably should still be more intimate, and I think the cinema experience, partly because the cinema experience is shared with a lot of other people. At home, it's you and people and love. I assume that you're sitting watching these things with, but in a cinema, it's a bunch of strangers. And you kind of don't want the intimate moments in a room full of strangers. You want those, you want the excitement and the thrills and the all that stuff in a room full of strangers, where you can be slightly more entertained and less provocative. And obviously, we're ignoring the entire art house kind of thinking, which is somewhat different.
Okay, Anne-Louise, what do you think about this?
Yes, I agree with Robert that it feels like it's about scale, and about sort of the scope of what you see on the screen. And I think also traditionally films that were standalone were a complete narrative arc within the one film. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't make a series. So I think about the Bond movies, because we've got a new one of those out at the moment, where each film is contained within its own little story narrative arc. And generally, there's not much crossover. Now, the Daniel Craig Bond era has changed that and played with it a little bit by having the sort of a bit of a thread running through of the way Bond's MI6 is changing and the way the world around him is changing. But that's a more recent development. If you go back to the original Bond films, you know, stuff that's happened previously is sometimes barely ever referred to again. And in each one is complete, and you don't need to have watched any of the others to understand who this guy is and broadly what's happening. So
Quote was stroking his cat in 3 movies before we met him. And then we had 3 movies dealing with him. So that's a 6-film arc with 2 different actors as James Bond from 1962 to 1970, which is more or less what Daniel Craig has reinvented or has been reinvented around Daniel Craig. And that was carried over from what Ian Fleming had done in the books. So I don't think this is necessarily a new thing.
So interesting, all the different opinions about this, right?
Certainly, in terms of, if you look at much older franchises, like say Tarzan, in the Tarzan films of the 30s and into the 40s, there is a continuity between Tarzan gets married and there's a Tarzan finds a son. And it's because the actors get older, so you have threads, and there's a whole dynastic through story in the Frankenstein movies, where you get Bride of Frankenstein followed by the son of Frankenstein, and you still need to see the family, and then Frankenstein meets the Wolfman may well be what invented the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The notion that disparate stories could be put together. It's even got that weird thing that Frankenstein is essentially a science fiction character and the Wolfman is essentially a supernatural character. So, as with Iron Man and Thor, you have this sort of clash of genre underpinnings in one film that pulls them all together. Eventually, you'll get Abbott and Costello. That's the doom to all franchises.
Maybe we'll see the doom of franchises very soon. Rachel, what do you think about this?
I don't know. I mean, it doesn't really make much sense to me to think about TV and film as, this is going to sound really ridiculous, but to think of them as 2 completely separate media anymore, purely because of that fluidity now, and because of the fact that, as Robert says, originally that you have the historical epics of the 1950s and 1960s conceived of in direct opposition to what TV can do, because TV is small, it's black and white, it doesn't have that kind of epic scale, whereas film, you can go widescreen, you can have money fired at the screen, you can have all singing, all dancing, and you get some magnificent films. Well, okay, there's one, Cleopatra 1963, probably could have done with being a TV series instead of an 18-hour long historical epic, but I love every second of it. I don't care. But these days, as Robert says, you don't have those limitations with TV anymore. And I did threaten to talk about historical epic. I am sorry about this. I'm going to take us off on a tangent because it's my area of passion. Where you see these historical epics, the sword and sandal films, when they get revived at the early part of this century, they move very quickly off the big screen and onto the small screen, because the small screen can do this now. The small screen can cope with the demands of epic storytelling, but what it can also do is allow that closer focus in on the personal, on the micro-historical, rather than specifically the macro-historical. And to me, I mean, I think the fact that we are getting this crossover, because you're seeing showrunners from successful TV franchises now moving into effectively showrunning large-scale movie franchises, that allows for what's good about each medium to kind of transfer back and forward, which I think is kind of exciting, to be honest. You know, when you think about Star Trek, the original series, another thing that I will talk at length about if anybody doesn't stop me, those all, if you like, functioned as little mini films. There was the, you know, they hit the reset button at the end of each episode. They had very little relationship to each other, and there certainly wasn't an overarching narrative to the series. You know, Kirk and Spock did some stuff, they sorted it out. Then the next week they did some more stuff and they sorted that out, which is great and it really worked, but that's not what we expect anymore. We're expecting these overarching narratives that drive us throughout the series and maybe drive us across multiple series. So to me, I think that TV and film are drawing strength from each other, and I think that's kind of exciting.
I think the thing about both of these medium is that they're both still quite young. So film with sound isn't even 100 years old. Television is, you know, realistically from the 1950s. TV doesn't really get into colour until the 1970s in any sort of enduring way. And to an extent, I think for a long time, both of them were still trying to figure out what they were and how they worked and how they told stories. And now the streaming services like Netflix and Amazon and Disney Plus have come along and disrupted that, because what you see as the person sitting there in front of your menu screen is just a selection of different things that, until you sort of click onto it partially to see what it is, you don't necessarily know if it's a film or an ongoing series or the mini series or something else that's, you know, like a series of 6 episodes, but all of them are 10 minutes. And, you know, again, when we talk about TV, there's a sort of British version of TV shows versus an American version of TV shows. And probably the obvious example of that from recently is The Office, which did sort of 2 or 3 series in the UK and ran in the US for years and years and years. And each season in itself was quite long. And so, you know, what different audiences in different countries expect from either film or TV may in and of itself be quite different.
A lot of not just fiction television, but all television derives still quite closely from radio, the medium it essentially took over from. All formats, adventure shows, soap operas, the news, were ported over almost straightforwardly from radio in the first place. I do think that probably television, in the end, everything turns into soap opera. That's the ultimate evolutionary format of television, and that, for instance, is what happened in the difference between the original series of Star Trek, as you say, standalone episodes, because once they reached syndication, they could be repeated out of order, to the notion of story arcs, which kind of screws up the possibility of ever repeating it, because you then have to sit through 8 years of story, which fans will do with box sets, but they won't do with actual television. They may do it with streaming now. The format was therefore driven by how American television was exhibited, advertising led mostly. British shows had arcs and all those complicated serial things because they didn't need to rely on repeats. If you look at your British crime or spy shows, Callan is a good example of that. It was doing season-long arcs in the 60s. It was a format that we tended to use a lot. The only shows that didn't do that are the film shows like The Avengers or The Prisoner, which had an eye on selling to America.
One of the things that strikes me, I kind of had a little bit more of a rigid thought about this before I started doing this conversation, but it occurs to me that even the line between film and television actually probably has always been a little bit blurred. they've fed into each other constantly. And I'm thinking about the film serials of, the 30s, 40s, and 50s, things like Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon and Batman and Superman. I mean, they're all doing this kind of serial thing, and it's a kind of cinema experience that most of us now probably haven't experienced. But we could go and watch these films in episodes every single week as part of a bigger package. So it's almost like you've got a television schedule on a day. You have your little your little bit of thrill, your little bit of story, and you come back to it again. So like those obviously are very complex, maybe relatively simplistic stories, but the relatively complex story arcs that over 10, 24 serials, 24 weeks of repeated viewing to kind of catch up and everything. And I remember Channel 4 in the UK used to screen these things early in the mornings. And as a kid, I wouldn't catch every single one of them. I would catch maybe half of them. And you kind of knew most of what was going on in the story. So that for me sort of reminds me that it's okay whenever I miss like 12 Marvel films in a row, because I'm going to pick up somewhere along the way. And actually that kind of narrative thing that's there for the people who want to kind of keep on going in and get fed that, and to really sort of really feed off that ongoing story are catered for. But as long as there's enough individuality within the story itself, within the episode itself of this wider story arc, then that'll please anybody else. And that's the important thing. I mean, the danger is that a film still has obviously much bigger budgets. They have a much more limited way of being able to recoup that stuff. So it's quite important that the casual viewer who's just looking for something to watch on a Friday night can go in there and follow the story and be engaged and talk about it, and actually kind of want to go and see whatever else came on the other side of it.
There is a crucial evolutionary point in the early 1950s, and there are a couple of franchises in particular. One is Superman, and another is the Lone Ranger, which had been comic books and radio shows before they were film serials. And then they became TV series in the 1950s. But crucially, there was a film called Superman and the Mole Men, and there's a film called The Lone Ranger, which are series pilots. They are feature versions of what would then be half-hour weekly shows. The other one of those is Disney's Davy Crockett, which was one of the first huge multimedia pop culture franchise. It had a hit single. Kids wore those stupid hats. And Disney repackaged episodes of the series as feature films. It's like, that, and the company is still doing it all these years later. They probably still own Davy Crockett, who at some point will come back.
I think there is actually a much bigger conversation here, maybe with the whole, not globalization per se, but this discussion of attention span, with kids now watching TikToks for 15 seconds, and how do you structure your content around this attention span of less than a minute?
Kids will play computer games for 17 hours straight. You can't tell me they don't have attention spans.
That is true. But there's also this Netflix approach to it, right? Coming back again to this, it should be binge watching now instead of release one episode per week. So maybe there's a different approach here coming all together into this franchises, fitting into continuity versus getting new viewers. Of course, you are getting new viewers for even Marvel films that are released throughout 12 years now. And their audience as well is new with each film, right? So they don't have to watch films from the start. What are your thoughts on this? Is there a tension between this attention span, binge watching, film releases, etc., scheduling, maybe?
But there's a movement now amongst the streaming services. I know Netflix model is still very much fire it all out and let people watch it whenever they want to, but Amazon and Disney and other streaming services like that have moved. I'm not sure whether they've moved back to, or they have set out to release on that one per week, which I will put my hand up and admit I hate. I live in the internet age. I want to be able to sit down and watch everything that is in a series when I have the time to do it, and it's wrecking me a bit that I have to wait every week for Lower Decks. But I think there's something to be said for that. I'm not sure what, but and then again, I think about I what Robert was saying about you can miss a couple of the Marvel Cinematic Universe films and dive back in. I kind of disagree. Not if you want to get the full sort of thrust of the narrative arc. I mean, I missed quite a few of them. I have two small children, so I haven't been to the cinema in a long time, and I missed quite a few of them. And when it came to Endgame, I had no clue what the setup for that was, and I watched it. But I wished I hadn't, because then I went back and watched everything, and it all made more sense to me. So there, I mean, like I said, I really like what the Marvel Cinematic Universe has done, and I think that is a product of the fact that it has been treated as though it is a TV franchise from the beginning, and it's been treated almost with TV showrunner-esque names behind it. But there are drawbacks to it, which is that it is exclusive and it is exclusionary to a certain extent if you haven't seen the other ones, because you're not getting the same movie experience.
Anne-Louise, what do you think about the scheduling situation?
Yeah, the binge watching is definitely a thing, isn't it? And yeah, the Netflix tactic of seemingly just dropping it all at once is definitely to encourage, 68 million people have watched this within the first 28 days of release, and whatever the numbers are for everything. And Disney's approach of, we're just going to release one episode a week of the new thing we're releasing. Yeah, it feels like being back on the old time broadcast TV schedule. And if it is a show that is huge and you haven't watched it at the point at which it's been broadcast, then you're going to miss out on the water cooler conversation at work the next day, which in the point in time at which a lot of people are still working from home is perhaps a strange concept to try and sort of deal with, but I'm going to guess that those conversations have moved to Discord or chat rooms or whatever else for fandoms, rather than maybe things being more broad brush amongst work colleagues. Yeah, that's my thought.
Yeah, the streaming practice of either releasing everything at once or one episode a week isn't actually mimicking TV scheduling at all, because you still have the choice. You become the programmer. You can wait till all the episodes are there and watch it all in one gulp as well. The point of doing weekly releases is to dominate conversation. We've all know there are some Netflix shows which people like, are very successful, but people watch and then they disappear off the algorithm really, really quickly and are essentially buried. And unless they get like an Emmy push or whatever, disappear forever. By releasing something episode a week, you maintain the interest, and none of these people are actually that concerned about viewing figures for individual works. What they're interested in is take up for them. And there's a part of me that's actually fascinated in the sort of the way that as a horror writer you study sociopaths, with how the mindset of people scheduling these things and programming these things work. It's nothing to do with whether people are going to watch it or like it. It's to do with whether they take up the subscriptions. That's what streaming services are interested in. Whereas what we think of as more old-fashioned terrestrial television is interested in viewing figures, just as movie theaters are interested in admissions. That's how they rate their success. In the end, it's how they rate their money. Viewing figures translate into advertising revenue.
Thank you, Kim. And without binge watching and this overflow of content, maybe you'll just forget that you've been watching this TV episode for weeks. So, Robert, what do you think? Do you have this?
Oh, I flip between the two. I mean, I've just binge watched a couple of. I binge watched Ghosts when it came on. There, it's only 6 episodes. It's fine. That's what I love about British shows is that they tend to be within a manageable 3 to 8 hour chunk. That's a bit of my life that I can probably find to do in one, and have a toilet break when I choose with something of that duration. And that's sort of the real appeal for me. So I watched Ghosts, and then I've been watching The Cleaner, the new Greg Davies comedy there during the week. I don't tend to binge watch the bigger shows. I mean, actually, I just watched Vigil as well on the BBC and was really quite happy to have that 6 week drawn out drama to kind of get excited to have to mull over plot points to kind of think about it, instead of just seeing it all in one big chunk. It's that after image for me that I guess has the appeal. But I mean, like, considering so many of us are interested not just in what's current but also in what's past, we all have collections of, well, most of us have collections of DVDs and Blu-rays and as well as our streaming options. So we're quite used to like picking and choosing and scheduling our own kind of viewing anyway. It's got nothing to do really with what's current. I mean, we still pick and choose what we want to watch. It's just that some things we can only watch in certain bits of time, and we kind of want to get ahead of the trend. We don't want someone spoiling something for us on Twitter 5 minutes after it's been broadcast, which has happened to me before and incurred great shouts. So sort of avoid the internet for a couple of days just because I want to see something that I know people are going to talk about. So yeah, so it's kind of it's in flux. I mean, everything's so changeable, and the pandemic I think has also changed. All it has probably helped change some of our habits with this, because a lot of us have been stuck within four walls. We've not been socializing. We've not been going out. We've not been given the same chance to go to the cinemas. We've not been given the chance to have those water cooler moments, because we literally aren't seeing our friends and our colleagues at the water cooler. And the online forum is a different space. There's a different way of conversations. The same way, if we were doing this conversation via chat, we would respond to each other very differently than we can do whenever we can see each other and interact live. So I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, and I'm not sure what's good and what's bad. I like that we have the option. I mean, I'll still happily binge watch a series from 20 years ago. But then there's other times where, you know what, I've got my half hour of a day that I can set aside to it, and I'll do it that way. So yeah.
Anne-Louise, you wanted to say something?
Yes, and that somebody spoiled it on Twitter 5 minutes after it's been broadcast on the once a week release schedule is why it is still like people feel that they have to watch at the point at which it drops. Because if you are invested in wanting to know the story, you want to sit and watch it rather than having somebody on Twitter or on Facebook go, oh my God, they killed Kevin, or whatever the huge thing that happened that week was, and you haven't been able to see it. So whilst for the streaming services, yes, the take-up of subscriptions long-term might be important. For the audience, what's important is being there for what will become the water cooler moment.
Thank you. Rachel, do you have anything else to say?
No, I kind of just agree with what's already been said. If we are going to assume that Twitter and the sort of online forums are our water coolers, then yeah, I mean, I've had that as well. Although it's not just limited to streaming programs or fiction or anything like that. I mean, I watch Tour de France every year, and I couldn't go anywhere near because we could only watch it in the evening after the highlights had been broadcast. But Twitter was like, oh my God, he won. And like, shut up, not all of us have got to watch it live. So it is very much that sense of you do want to be ahead of the curve. But again, it's very, very easy to forget that sometimes in the online space, that not everybody's watching it at the same time. And I don't know if that is sort of a generational thing, that I grew up, I came of age at a time when everybody was watching everything all together, but we didn't have the internet, obviously. So I don't know, that's a very unformed and not very coherent way of saying, yeah, I kind of agree with everything that's just been said.
And then that's also sort of an age-old issue too. I mean, when you think about the likes of Hitchcock, who knew in his marketing that people were going to go in and watch Psycho and spoil the ending, marketed that in so that people were bought into this kind of contract that they didn't tell other people about what happens. So the twists, and I won't spoil them in case anybody watching this actually hasn't seen this 60-year-old classic. You know, so those twists wouldn't be ruined because obviously, you know, you want to kind of grow that. You want people to talk about it without giving away that stuff. Whereas some people just get off on giving away the little tiny things that make the story something else.
Yes, they do that with The Mousetrap, which is the West End of London theatre's longest running stage show. And it's always been like a massive secret as to the reveal of what happens. And I've been to see it now in the theatre, and they get to the end, and the story ends, and the cast takes their bows, and then a member of the cast steps forward and basically says, "Please don't spoil this for people who haven't seen a play that's been running for 60 years." Yeah, in that, but the Wikipedia entry tells you.
We have actually some questions from the audience now. If we're talking about episodic TV shows, what were the first TV series that used overarching narratives? Can you remember any? Or maybe the first you saw, if you don't remember, like historically.
Well, Kim's already talked about Quatermass.
Yeah, I mean, soap operas always used it. In American television, probably what brought series arcs to the fore was primetime soaps like Peyton Place and Dallas and Dynasty. They broke with the self-contained episode with the reset button format because they had to. British television, I mean, if you look at, I don't know, Z-Cars or shows from the 50s and 60s, they tend to do standalone episodes, but over characters develop and change. A policeman will get promoted. I remember Softly had a whole arc for one season with a policeman becoming corrupt. And that was about 1970. So it's something that's always been part of the way we tell stories in Britain on television. In America, because of the sense of syndication being the goal, it took a longer time to come in. But it's something that probably American TV, I mean genre TV, embraced because audiences like it. After all, people spotted the reset button and started to make fun of it. There's always a standing joke that if your hero, who is a lone, embittered detective or space adventurer, fell in love with a girl, she'd die at the episode, and that happened over and over and over. Again, there was a really solid reasons for it, but it became an irritating convention that had to be broken.
Thank you, Kim. And I think we have 5 more minutes to go. So if you would like to say anything in conclusion, maybe promote your other panels or yourself, feel free to do so. I can appoint people again, Rachel.
Would promote my other panels and stuff. I've got a reading at 2:30. If anybody's interested in coming along to that. No, I mean, I suppose in conclusion, I'm really interested to see where this goes. I mean, one of my theoretical feet is in sort of film history, so I am fascinated to see how this evolves and sort of see it as part of the ongoing kind of exchange between film and television, which is as old as television, and as old as any of the media. But as the technological capacities shift and the sort of the audience behavior shifts, I do find it fascinating, and I think it's productive, and I think it's challenging to both media, and I'm interested to see what happens next. Although I do feel like we could have done without the last Indiana Jones installment if we're talking about a sequel that didn't need to be there. I think we could have lived without that one.
Robert, what about you?
I was thinking there about the serials and British television. I'm thinking actually about Quatermass Experiment, which then had its own sequel. It's a six-parter overarching narrative, but then it had a sequel, Quatermass 2. So actually, you have like series that are sequeling series, which I quite like. And then, of course, there's the film adaptations as well. In terms of our stuff, I'll be chatting to Rachel and Kim again tomorrow for a panel on the intersection of comedy and horror, and that's at 1 o'clock. So do tune in for that as well.
Anne-Louise?
Yeah, I've suddenly thought that I don't think we need any more Mission Impossible films, really. Or if
no.
we do, they probably need to change so that it's not Tom Cruise. But of course, Mission Impossible comes from the TV series. So that's interesting that things swap media. This is the only panel I'm on this weekend, but I am floating around the Glasgow in 2024 bid table a fair bit. So please call on, talk to us about the bid. If you've not already supported, please consider pre-supporting. Thank you very much.
Beautiful, thank you. And Kim?
I wanted to slightly address something that Robert said earlier about how film is more expensive and more expansive than television. It can also be cheaper. If you look at, say, something like Paranormal Activity, that would not have been commissioned or run by any television show. It would have looked too cheap. Film can sometimes afford to be smaller than television. Particularly, actually, obviously, my area of interest, horror films. You can have stories which shut down completely by everybody dying.
All right, and on that note, I think we're ready to go. Thank you very much for all the panels. Thank you for the audience, and thank you very much. Goodbye.